My husband hurt me again, my daughter whispered from a hospital bed at 2:17 in the morning. Then she looked past me toward the emergency room doors and added, "This was number 48. Hannah's left wrist was wrapped in a temporary splint. 5 stitches crossed her hairline, and purple fingerprints were darkening beneath her jaw." Before I could ask how any father could fail to notice 47 earlier cries for help, a man in a gray raincoat stepped from the shadows of the parking garage and said, "Don't confront Mason yet. He has backing, and some of it carries your name." He disappeared before I could stop him, leaving me with a question that would soon threaten my daughter, my granddaughter, and everything I had spent 40 years building. My name is Walter Bennett, and I was 69 when I finally learned that providing for a family is not the same as protecting one. Stay with me, because this began long before that night. 6 hours earlier, I had been asleep in the same brick ranch house where my wife, Claire, and I had raised our 2 children. Claire had been gone 3 years by then, taken by pancreatic cancer after a marriage that lasted 41 years and still felt too short. I had left her side only twice during her final month, both times because Mason Cole, my son-in-law, claimed his restoration company was facing an emergency. That was the kind of man I believed Mason to be: ambitious, overextended, occasionally arrogant, but devoted to Hannah and their daughter, Ellie. I had helped him start Cole Recovery Services with a $200,000 loan and a limited corporate guarantee. I had introduced him to insurers, contractors, and county officials. When people asked whether they could trust him, I had said, "He's family." I did not understand how much damage a sentence like that could do when spoken by a man whose reputation opened doors. The call came from an unfamiliar number. A tired woman introduced herself as a nurse at Grant Medical Center and asked whether I was Hannah Cole's father. My first thought was a car accident. My second was Ellie. Before the nurse could explain, I heard Hannah in the background say, "Don't tell Mason," he called. The word "he" froze me more than any mention of blood or broken bones could have. I pulled on yesterday's jeans, grabbed my keys, and drove through cold October rain with both hands locked around the steering wheel. Hannah had suffered from anxiety since Claire died, and Mason often complained that she panicked over harmless things. I had accepted his version because it was organized, calm, and convenient. On that drive, memories began lining up differently: canceled dinners, long sleeves in July, a split lip blamed on a cabinet door, and the way Hannah always checked the driveway before speaking honestly. I found her behind a pale curtain in the emergency department. Her face looked smaller than I remembered, as though fear had been shaving pieces from her for years. A social worker stood near the bed, and a city police officer waited outside. Hannah tried to smile when I entered, but the movement pulled at the stitches above her eyebrow. "Dad, please don't make a scene," she said. That request wounded me because she knew exactly what I had always done when threatened: raised my voice, written a check, called someone important, and forced the problem into a shape I could manage. I sat instead. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, "What does 48 mean?" She stared at her swollen fingers. "It means I counted," she answered. "Every time he shoved me, grabbed me, locked me out, drove too fast to scare me, or made sure the bruises stayed where clothes covered them. Tonight he stopped caring where they showed." Before Hannah could tell me more, Mason came through the curtain carrying her purse and wearing the navy quarter-zip sweater I had given him for Christmas. His hair was damp from the rain, but his breathing was steady. "Thank God you're here, Walt," he said, as if we were 2 reasonable men gathering around an unfortunate woman. He told me Hannah had mixed a prescription sleep aid with wine, become confused, and fallen down the basement stairs. Hannah's eyes dropped immediately. Mason placed her purse beside the bed, touched her uninjured shoulder, and said, "Honey, you scared us." The social worker asked him to step outside. His expression tightened for less than a second before returning to concern. Then he mentioned that the imaging report showed no internal bleeding. The nurse had not discussed imaging results in front of us yet. When I asked how he knew, Mason said a doctor had called him. The officer looked up and quietly wrote something down. Mason resisted leaving until the social worker reminded him that Hannah had requested privacy. At the curtain, he turned to me and lowered his voice. Ellie's safe with my mother, so don't do anything impulsive. It sounded helpful, but the order beneath it was unmistakable. I asked why our 9-year-old granddaughter was not with him. Because somebody needs to think clearly, he replied. Then he smiled at Hannah without warmth. You know how custody judges feel about unstable parents. Hannah flinched harder at the word custody than she had when the nurse adjusted her splint. Mason saw it and walked away satisfied. I wanted to follow him into the hallway and put him against the wall. For 30 years, I had supervised loading docks where one angry decision could kill a man. I had taught younger workers that control was not weakness. That lesson kept my hands at my sides, though every part of me wanted a simpler kind of justice. After Mason left, Hannah admitted she had not fallen. She had refused to sign a document at the kitchen counter, and he had twisted her wrist until she dropped the pen. When she tried to reach the front door, he pushed her into the banister. She struck her head, and Mason left her on the floor while he called his mother to collect Ellie. What document? I asked. Hannah said it concerned Riverbend Industrial Park, the 4-warehouse property held by Bennett Family Holdings. I owned 52% of the voting interest. Hannah and her older brother, Lucas, each owned 24%. Under our operating agreement, selling the property required 75% approval. My vote plus either child's would be enough. Mason had spent months insisting Riverbend was an outdated asset and that selling it could relieve the pressure on his company. I had refused because the warehouses produced reliable income and secured retirement benefits for several longtime employees. I asked why Mason needed her signature if he could simply persuade me or Lucas. Hannah gave a bitter laugh that sounded nothing like my daughter. He knows you won't sell to the buyer he chose, she said, and he already has Lucas. I asked what that meant, but she shook her head and looked toward the hallway. The social worker returned with paperwork for an emergency safety plan. Hannah could leave with me, but Ellie would remain with Mason's mother unless Mason voluntarily released her or a court entered another order. The thought of my granddaughter sleeping under the roof of people who believed Hannah was the problem made my stomach burn. Still, the lawyer inside my own head, the cautious voice Claire used to tease me for having warned that charging into that house would give Mason exactly what he wanted, proof that the Bennett family was reckless, controlling, and dangerous. While Hannah signed the discharge forms with her right hand, I went downstairs to bring my truck around. The rain had thinned to a mist, and the parking garage smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. That was when the man in the gray raincoat approached. He was around 60, lean, with tired eyes and the posture of someone accustomed to waiting unnoticed. Walter Bennett, he asked. I demanded his name. He glanced toward the security camera above us and said, Simon Keene, I review troubled commercial loans. Before I could ask which bank, he continued, Your son-in-law has been borrowing against support he may not actually possess. I told him Mason's company had no claim on Riverbend. Simon replied, That is not what the documents say. Then came the warning he has backing. Not political backing. Not the kind you're imagining. Paper backing. Access. Signatures. Your family's name. I stepped closer and asked him to show me the documents. Simon refused. He said his employer's legal department had not authorized direct disclosure and that talking to me in the garage was already a risk. Then, why are you here? I asked. He studied me for a moment. Because your daughter's name appears on something dated next week. And I saw her brought in tonight. That sentence made the garage seem colder. I asked whether Mason had forged her signature. Simon said he had not used that word. He advised me to secure original corporate records, review every electronic permission connected to Bennett Family Holdings, and avoid telling Mason what I knew. If he believes the documents will work, he may show you who helped him create them. Simon said. A black sedan turned into the lane, its headlights passing across his face. When I looked back after it moved on, he was walking toward the stairwell. I drove Hannah to my house just before dawn. She sat rigidly beside me, holding her injured wrist against her chest. Halfway there, she said, You're wondering how I let it happen 48 times. I told her I was wondering how I had missed it 47 times. She looked out the window. You didn't miss everything. You accepted the explanations. She was right. 4 years earlier, When I noticed bruises on her upper arm, Mason said she had slipped while carrying laundry. Later, Hannah called me crying after midnight, but I advised her not to let one ugly argument destroy a good marriage. When she stopped working at our office, Mason said motherhood overwhelmed her. I told myself I was respecting their boundaries. The truth was less flattering. I preferred problems with invoices, contracts, and numbers, because numbers did not look me in the eye and ask whether I had failed them. At home, I made coffee neither of us drank. Hannah asked for an old blue blanket Claire had knitted, then sat at the kitchen table while morning light entered through the blinds. When she reached into her purse, she frowned. This isn't how I packed it. The lining had been pulled loose near one corner. She turned the purse upside down, and a white envelope slid onto the table. Mason must have carried the purse to the hospital without noticing the hidden pocket beneath the lining. Hannah pressed her palm over the envelope as though it contained something alive. I started keeping records after the 5th time, she said. I reconstructed the first 4 from messages and doctor visits. Inside were printed photographs, pharmacy receipts, copies of bank transfers, and pages numbered by hand from 1 to 48. Every entry included a date, an injury or threat, what Mason demanded afterward, and whether she complied. The pattern was impossible to dismiss once I saw it laid out. After Incident 11, Hannah transferred $42,000 from an account Claire had left her. After Incident 18, she approved a questionable invoice from a subcontractor connected to Mason. After Incident 26, she signed a personal guarantee she said she had never been allowed to read. The amounts grew as the violence became more calculated. I took out my accountant's pencil and added the transfers twice, because I did not trust the first total $684,000. Hannah watched me write it at the bottom of the page. He said it was temporary. She whispered. He said if his company failed, your name would fail with it, and hundreds of people would blame me. I asked why she had not come to me. Because he showed me papers with your signature. She answered. He said you already knew. That accusation struck deeper than Mason's threats. Years earlier, I had signed a limited guarantee to help his company complete a storm recovery contract. The obligation had been capped, tied to one project, and scheduled to expire. I had never told Hannah the details because I did not want her worrying about business. My silence had given Mason room to invent the rest. In entry 41, Hannah wrote that he had shown her a copy of my signature beneath language promising continued support from Bennett Family Holdings. In entry 46, he claimed Lucas had approved selling Riverbend and that only her emotional selfishness stood between the family and financial safety. Entry 48 described the kitchen and the pen, her refusal, and the words Mason spoke while bending her wrist. Once you sign, everyone gets to keep what matters. If you don't, I'll make sure Ellie learns you chose money over her. Beneath the final entry was a folded document marked Draft, Member Consent. It authorized the sale of Riverbend Industrial Park for $5 million, far below the valuation I had received the previous spring. The proposed buyer was an investment company I had never heard of. The document was dated 2 days in the future. My signature line was blank, but Lucas's name appeared beneath an electronic signature. Hannah's signature was already there, though she swore she had never signed it. I examined the letters closely. The shape looked convincing, until I noticed that the capital H matched an old insurance form exactly, including a small ink hesitation caused by a failing pen. Someone had lifted it from a stored document. Then I saw the notary block. It stated that Hannah had appeared voluntarily before Denise Parker, our office manager, and signed in her presence. Denise's seal had been copied beneath the statement. I had known Denise for 23 years. She kept her notary stamp locked in the bottom drawer of her desk and recorded every acknowledgement in a bound journal. She would not notarize a grocery list without identification. Yet the draft contained her seal, Hannah's stolen signature, Lucas's approval, and corporate language available only inside our private server. Simon's warning returned to me, paper backing. Access. Signatures. Family name. Hannah asked what I was going to do. The old version of me would have called Mason immediately and told him the game was over. Instead, I slid every page back into the envelope, photographed the order, and placed the original in the small fireproof safe beside Claire's china cabinet. First, I said, we find out how many people believe this document is real. Then I noticed a tiny server code printed at the bottom of the final page. It identified the user who had downloaded the template. The account belonged to my son, Lucas. I did not call Lucas that morning, though every instinct in me wanted to hear his voice before suspicion hardened into certainty. Instead, I called Mariana Holt, the attorney who had rewritten our operating agreement after Claire died. Marianne had silver hair, a dry sense of humor, and no patience for men who mistook confidence for truth. She arrived before 9 with 2 legal pads, a portable scanner, and a warning. Do not confront anyone until we preserve this properly, she said. Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her injured wrist elevated on a pillow, while Marianne photographed the envelope, numbered every page, and sealed the originals inside an evidence bag. She told us the records could support both a protection order and a financial investigation, but only if we stopped treating them like family papers and started treating them like evidence. That includes you, Walt, she said. No angry calls, no threats, and no heroic visits to Mason's house. I nodded, then made exactly the mistake she had warned me against. By noon, I had convinced myself I was not going to confront Mason. I was only going to retrieve Ellie, which sounded reasonable when I repeated it in my head. I drove to Mason's mother's house in Upper Arlington, where Ellie's pink bicycle leaned against the garage beside a row of trimmed boxwoods. Mason opened the door before I reached the porch. He held his phone loosely at his side, and I did not notice the red recording light. Ellie is not leaving with you, he said. I asked whether he planned to keep a child from her mother after putting that mother in the hospital. Mason stepped onto the porch and shut the door behind him. Hannah fell, he answered. You know she has episodes. I told him that if he used Ellie to control Hannah, I would make sure he lost his company, his house, and every dollar tied to my name. His expression remained calm. There it is, he said softly. The powerful father threatening to destroy anyone who disagrees with him. The door opened behind Mason, and his mother, Patricia, appeared with Ellie pressed against her side. Ellie wore pajamas even though it was past noon. When she saw me, she took one step forward, but Patricia tightened her grip on the child's shoulder. Your mother needs rest, Patricia told her. Ellie asked whether Hannah was coming home. Mason answered before I could speak. Mommy is getting help because she hurt herself. I felt something inside me snap loose. I told him Hannah had not hurt herself and that Ellie deserved the truth. Mason lifted his phone. Say it louder. Walt. Tell a 9-year-old her father is a monster while you stand on my mother's porch threatening us. I finally noticed the recording. That was the moment I understood I had not come to retrieve Ellie. I had walked into a scene Mason had prepared for me. I left without another word. But the damage was already stored on his phone. By the time I returned home, Mason had sent a 38-second clip to Marianne, Lucas, several relatives, and 2 members of the Bennett Holdings Advisory Board. The clip began with me saying I would make sure he lost everything, and ended before Mason mentioned Hannah's supposed instability. Lucas called immediately. What are you doing? He demanded. You sound unhinged. I asked why his server account had downloaded a sale resolution containing Hannah's forged signature. Silence filled the line for 2 full seconds. Then he said the code could have been copied and accused me of looking for someone to blame. Hannah is sick, Dad, he said. She has been since Mom died. Mason has spent years cleaning up after her. And now you're rewarding one breakdown by blowing apart the company. I asked whether he had approved selling Riverbend. He did not answer directly. We need liquidity, he said. Mason needs breathing room. And you need to stop treating every business decision like a monument to yourself. Lucas arrived an hour later, wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for bank meetings. He did not hug Hannah. He stood across from her in my living room and spoke in the careful tone of a man negotiating with a nervous client. Tell Dad what really happened, he said. Tell him you were drinking. Hannah's injured hand trembled beneath the blanket. She said she had consumed half a glass of wine at dinner and had taken no sleeping medication. Lucas looked at me. She changes details when she's scared. Hannah asked whether he gave Mason access to the company server. Lucas rubbed his jaw and said multiple vendors had temporary access, Then he turned the conversation toward Riverbend, claiming the property needed $600,000 in roof and drainage work. Selling now protects everyone, he said, including Hannah. I watched his left thumb scrape repeatedly against his wedding ring, a habit he had developed as a child whenever he lied about something important. Marianne ended the visit before I did more damage. She told Lucas that all future discussions about Riverbend would take place in writing, and that no sale could proceed while the authenticity of Hannah's consent was disputed. Lucas stared at the evidence bag on the dining room table. You're turning a family crisis into litigation, he said. Marianne replied, No. Someone turned violence into paperwork. We are identifying who. After he left, Hannah began crying, not loudly, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone whose worst fear had just been confirmed. She said Lucas had warned her 3 weeks earlier not to meet Mason alone on a Thursday because the financing people were pushing for signatures. At the time, she believed her brother was trying to help. Now she wondered whether he had known what Mason intended. I asked why she had not shown me the message. Because every time someone almost helps, she said, they remind me what it will cost them. That afternoon, Marianne contacted a domestic violence advocate named Renee Alvarez, who helped Hannah prepare a sworn statement and request temporary protection. Renee spoke to Hannah without rushing her, and never once asked why she had stayed. I noticed because nearly everyone else, including me, had silently asked that question. Renee explained that Mason's control over money, transportation, medical narratives, and Ellie was not separate from the physical harm. It was the structure that allowed the harm to continue. Hannah then described what happened after each numbered incident. Mason did not always demand money immediately. Sometimes he waited until the next morning, brought coffee, apologized, and explained that his company was under pressure because Walt Bennett had placed impossible expectations on him. Then he would slide a check, guarantee, invoice, or login screen across the table. He made signing feel like forgiveness. Hannah said, if I refused, he said I was proving I wanted the marriage to fail. I spent the next 2 days doing what I should have done years earlier, observing before acting. I changed the administrator password on Bennett Holdings' payment system, required 2 approvals for every outgoing transfer, and suspended all vendor access linked to coal recovery services. I moved the original corporate minute books from our downtown office to Marianne's secured file room and hired an independent digital forensics firm to preserve the server logs. I did not announce any of it. Mason discovered the changes when a scheduled payment to one of his subcontractors failed. He called Hannah 12 times within 40 minutes, then left a voicemail in a voice so gentle it made me colder than shouting would have. Your father is panicking and hurting innocent employees, he said. Tell him to restore the account before people lose their jobs. Hannah listened once, saved the recording, and handed her phone to Marianne. She did not call him back. The consequences arrived faster than I expected. On Friday morning, our operations manager reported that Bennett Holdings' primary account had been placed under temporary review. Payroll for 32 employees was due that afternoon. I called the bank and learned that a lender had flagged conflicting claims involving a continuing corporate guarantee connected to Mason's company. The officer would not explain further, but he said the bank had documents indicating Bennett Holdings supported a multi-million-dollar revolving credit line. I told him no such authorization existed. He replied that a member consent, officer certificate, and guarantee extension had all been submitted electronically. Until the conflict was resolved, the bank would restrict large transfers. I covered payroll from my personal line of credit, but word spread through the office that our accounts were frozen. 2 longtime supervisors asked whether the company was failing. For the first time, Mason's lies reached people who had nothing to do with our family. Simon Keene called me that evening from an unlisted number. His voice was quieter than before. You changed the permissions, he said. I asked how he knew. Because someone tried to use them after you did. He confirmed that the bank's risk department was reviewing Mason's loan package, though he could not send me copies without authorization. I asked whether Hannah's forged consent was part of it. A document bearing her name was used to support the borrower's claim that Riverbend would be sold. He said, the projected proceeds were listed as a repayment source. I told him the sale resolution was dated in the future. Simon paused. Then your problem is larger than a bad loan. He advised me to locate every guarantee I had ever signed for Mason. Before hanging up, he added, the language submitted to us looks authentic because most of it is authentic. Someone altered the one section that limited your responsibility. I found the original guarantee in a banker's box, marked 2018 Storm Project. Back then, Mason had won a contract to repair homes damaged by a series of tornadoes west of Dayton. His company needed temporary credit for materials, and I had guaranteed up to $400,000 for 18 months. Marianne had insisted on an expiration clause and a project-specific limitation. The first 4 pages of the version described by Simon sounded identical to my copy. The 5th page, however, had apparently been replaced with language extending Bennett Holdings' support to future obligations. My signature was on page 6. Someone did not need to forge it. They only needed to substitute 1 page between the signature and the terms. I remembered Mason praising Lucas for scanning our archives during the office relocation. At the time, I had considered it proof that my son was finally becoming a responsible steward of the business. Hannah sat across from me while I compared the guarantee with entries in her notebook. Incident 41 occurred 3 days after Mason obtained a new line of credit. She had written that he showed her a document with my signature and told her I had pledged everything to his company. He said if I left, he would default on purpose. She explained. He said the bank would take Riverbend, your employees would lose their pensions, and Lucas would blame me forever. I told her the guarantee did not allow that. She gave me a look I deserved. You never told me what it allowed. That was true. I had spent years keeping financial details from my children because I thought information created worry. In reality, secrecy had created authority for whoever claimed to know more. Mason had filled the spaces I left empty. He used my signature, my silence, and my reputation to make Hannah believe resistance would destroy everyone she loved. The digital forensics report arrived Monday morning. It showed that Lucas's credentials had accessed the corporate archive at 117 a.m. 3 weeks earlier. The account downloaded Hannah's old insurance form, Denise Parker's notary seal from a prior lease, the Riverbend operating agreement, and the 2018 guarantee. Atunopatruzeč Shidoi. The files were uploaded to an external address associated with coal recovery services. Lucas had told us his account might have been copied, so I asked the investigators whether remote theft was possible. They showed me the building's security logs. Lucas's badge opened the office garage at 1258 a.m. and the executive floor at 103. A camera in the elevator lobby captured him entering with Mason. Mason carried a laptop bag. Lucas carried a banker's box from our archive room. They remained inside for 56 minutes. I watched the footage 3 times. On the final viewing, I noticed Lucas hesitate before the elevator doors closed. Mason placed a hand on the back of his neck, not affectionately, but with the quiet ownership of a man reminding another who controlled the moment. It did not excuse my son, but it told me fear was part of whatever bound them together. Marianne advised me not to confront him yet. We know he gave access, she said. We do not know why. Hannah's phone buzzed while we spoke. Mason had sent a photograph of Ellie sitting at Patricia's breakfast table with a workbook open in front of her. The message beneath it read, "She's doing better without all this chaos." Hannah covered her mouth, but she did not collapse. She took a screenshot, forwarded it to Renee, and said, "He always sends something cruel right before he asks for money." 10 minutes later, another message arrived. Mason wrote that the bank would release the Bennett accounts if Walt restored the vendor permissions and agreed to proceed with the Riverbend sale. He attached a revised member consent showing my signature line, Lucas's approval, and Hannah's forged name. Then he added, "Your brother understands what happens if this falls apart." I looked from the message to the frozen image of Lucas and Mason entering our office after midnight. The betrayal was no longer a theory. My son had opened the door, supplied the records, and helped a man weaponize our family company against his own sister. Yet the hand on Lucas's neck suggested Mason held something over him. I closed the laptop and told Marianne, "I'm not calling either one of them." She asked what I planned to do. "I'm going to find out what Mason owns that Lucas is more afraid of losing than his sister." The first real break came from a mistake Mason believed was too small to matter. One of the 48 transfers in Hannah's notebook had gone to a company called Buckeye Environmental Services, supposedly for mold remediation at a school outside Dayton. The invoice looked ordinary until I searched the state business registry and found that Buckeye's mailing address matched a private mailbox rented by Lucas's college roommate. I traced another payment to the same address. Then a third, through a landscaping company that had never owned a truck. By sunrise, I had mapped nearly $200,000 moving from Hannah's inheritance into Mason's operating account, through fake vendors, and finally into a holding company called Northline Capital. Lucas was listed nowhere in its public records, but Northline's tax correspondence had once been delivered to his home. I sat alone in my office looking at the numbers and realized my son had not merely opened a door. He had money on the other side of it. Marianne urged me to move slowly. Money can prove participation, she said, but not motive. We subpoenaed nothing because we did not yet have a lawsuit broad enough to justify it. So I used records already available to Bennett Holdings. Northline had received consulting payments from us 5 years earlier for a warehouse conversion project Lucas had championed. The project failed before construction began, and I remembered Lucas blaming zoning delays. Our reserve account had dropped by $320,000 during the same quarter, then gradually recovered over 2 years through a series of unusually high rebate adjustments. I had approved the year-end statements without investigating because Claire had begun chemotherapy that winter. Lucas handled daily operations, and I was grateful to anyone who kept problems away from her hospital room. Mason had joined our vendor committee around that time. He must have seen the mismatched entries and understood they were more valuable hidden than reported. I found Lucas at a private dining room in our downtown office, staring at a sandwich he had not touched. I placed copies of the Northline payments, server logs, and security images on the table. His face changed when he saw the old reserve account statements. The anger left first, then the color. "How much does Mason know?" I asked. Lucas rubbed both hands over his face and said, "Everything." 5 years earlier, he had taken $320,000 from the company reserve to invest in a residential development near Dublin. He expected to return it within 90 days. Before anyone noticed, the developer vanished after using forged permits, and Lucas spent 2 years hiding the loss through inflated vendor credits and redirected bonuses. He had repaid most of it, but the original theft and false entries remained crimes, not accounting errors. Mason discovered the scheme while reviewing contractor payments and kept copies of every altered ledger. Lucas said Mason first used the secret to win business. He demanded preferred contracts, early payments, and access to our vendor database. Later, when coal recovery services began losing money, Mason wanted more. He said if I refused, he'd send the files to the board, the bank, and the county prosecutor. Lucas told me. He said you'd disown me before I reached the courthouse. I asked whether that fear justified helping him forge Hannah's consent. Lucas stared at the table. He claimed he believed Mason only wanted leverage to force a sale, not to hurt her. She always said she fell. He whispered. She always defended him. Hannah, who had been listening from the adjoining room with Marianne, stepped through the doorway. Her wrist was still in a brace. I defended him because he told me you already chose his side, she said. Lucas looked at her injury, then away. She asked how many times he needed to see her afraid before uncertainty became an excuse. The confrontation did not give me the satisfaction I had imagined. Lucas did not confess like a villain. He folded inward like the boy who once broke a neighbor's window and hid the baseball under his bed. That made his betrayal harder, not easier. He had loved Hannah when they were children. He had taught her to ride a bike and slept outside her bedroom after Claire's funeral because she could not bear silence. Yet when Mason forced him to choose between his sister's safety and his own reputation, Lucas chose himself repeatedly. Marianne told him he needed independent counsel and warned that destroying records would worsen his position. I told him I would pay for an initial consultation because he was my son, but I would not buy his innocence. "You will tell the truth when asked," I said. Lucas looked at me with raw panic. "You have no idea what that will do." Hannah answered before I could. "We know exactly what your silence did." Later that afternoon, Simon agreed to meet Marianne and me in a conference room at the bank's regional office. He wore the same gray raincoat, folded across the back of his chair, and brought no documents we were allowed to keep. He explained that Mason's credit line had survived repeated warning signs because the loan file appeared supported by Bennett Holdings' guarantee, Lucas's internal confirmations, and public statements I had made praising Mason. Whenever an analyst questioned the company's losses, Mason produced another piece of paper bearing a Bennett name. "That is the backing I warned you about," Simon said. "Not a senator, not organized crime, not some invisible patron. He built a wall out of your family's credibility." Simon pointed out that every layer seemed plausible alone. My old guarantee was genuine except for one substituted page. Lucas truly had authority to access corporate records. Hannah's signatures matched archived samples. My praise of Mason had been printed in trade publications and loan presentations. The truth changed the shape of the entire betrayal. Mason had not infiltrated our family from the outside with some brilliant criminal plan. We had handed him the materials one piece at a time. I gave him my name because I wanted to feel generous. Lucas gave him passwords because he wanted to feel safe. Hannah gave him signatures because she wanted Ellie and the rest of us protected. Mason's talent was recognizing which fear belonged to each of us. He told me that family loyalty meant trust. He told Lucas that loyalty meant silence. He told Hannah that loyalty meant endurance. Then he made every one of us believe the others had already surrendered. Simon leaned forward and said, "Men like him rarely invent power. They borrow it from people who are ashamed to admit what they gave away." Marianne glanced at me, and I understood that my next decision could not be another attempt to control the family from above. When we returned home, Hannah asked to hear everything. I showed her the original 2018 guarantee and explained its limits. She read the expiration clause twice, then closed the folder and began to cry. "He said you knew about every loan," she told me. "He said you kept extending them because you believed in him more than you believed in me." I wanted to call Mason a liar and leave it there, but that would have been another convenient half-truth. I admitted that years earlier, when Hannah called after one of their worst arguments, I had urged her not to ruin a good marriage during a difficult season. I admitted I had praised Mason in front of lenders without asking how he treated her behind closed doors. "I thought I was keeping peace," I said. Hannah shook her head. "You were keeping yourself from having to choose. There was no defense against that. I had mistaken neutrality for wisdom, while my daughter paid the price." Hannah then revealed why she had continued documenting the abuse without leaving. Mason had convinced her that exposing him would collapse his company, trigger the altered guarantee, reveal Lucas's theft, and freeze Bennett Holdings' accounts. He said hundreds of workers would lose wages and retirees would lose benefits. He even showed her a draft news article blaming the Bennett family for fraudulent contracting. "Every time I thought about telling you," she said, "I saw Ellie losing her father, you losing the business, and Lucas going to prison." Mason had made suffering feel like a civic duty. Renee, the advocate, reminded her that he had manufactured those consequences and assigned her responsibility for preventing them. Hannah listened, but I could see how deeply the logic had rooted itself. 4 years of fear cannot be removed by one correct explanation. She still believed, somewhere beneath reason, that everyone's survival depended on her obedience. That evening, Marianne and I designed a strategy built around Mason's confidence. We would not accuse him publicly or warn him that Lucas had confessed. I would behave like a frightened businessman who cared more about Riverbend and payroll than about the truth. I would tell Mason I was willing to consider the sale if he produced clean originals, a complete lender payoff statement, and the buyer's final offer. Under Bennett Holdings' operating agreement, any major property sale required a formal member meeting, disclosure of related interests, and original signatures witnessed by counsel. Mason would believe those requirements were procedural obstacles he could manipulate. In reality, they would force him to identify the source of the documents, repeat his claims before the bank and buyer, and commit to one version of the story. "The trap is not getting him to lie," Marianne said. "He has already lied. The trap is making him choose which lie he is willing to sign." I called Mason the next morning. He answered on the first ring, too quickly for a man who wanted to appear indifferent. I told him the frozen accounts had changed my position and that I was prepared to sell Riverbend if the transaction protected our employees and released every Bennett obligation connected to his company. He was silent long enough to calculate whether I had surrendered. Then his voice warmed. "That is all I ever wanted," he said. "I told him we would hold a member meeting within 10 days and that I expected the bank, buyer, Denise, and all voting members present." Mason objected to Denise, claiming the existing notarization made her attendance unnecessary. I said my insurance carrier required verification. He gave in. Before hanging up, he added, "Hannah will need to confirm she signed willingly." I replied, "Bring whatever proves your position." He laughed softly. "You finally understand what's at stake." He had no idea that, for the first time, I did. Our plan lasted less than 6 hours before Mason struck back. A process server arrived at my house with an emergency custody petition. Mason alleged that Hannah was mentally unstable, abusing medication, and being manipulated by a violent father seeking control of family assets. Attached was the edited recording from Patricia's porch, a copy of Hannah's anxiety treatment records, and statements from 2 employees of Coal Recovery Services who claimed she had appeared confused at company events. Mason requested temporary primary custody of Ellie and supervised contact for Hannah until a psychological evaluation could be completed. He also asked the court to bar me from any contact with Ellie. Marianne said the allegations were contestable, but emergency family orders were often decided quickly and cautiously. Until a hearing, Patricia would keep Ellie. Hannah read the petition once, then placed it on the table with such care that I knew she was close to breaking. The bank called an hour later and announced a broader freeze on Bennett Holdings' operating accounts because Mason had accused me of interfering with collateral tied to an active loan. Payroll had been covered, but vendor payments, roof repairs, and employee benefit contributions were now delayed. Our operations manager warned that 2 key customers might leave if we could not issue performance guarantees by Friday. I liquidated a portion of my retirement portfolio to establish a temporary payroll reserve, locking in losses I had spent years avoiding. Lucas's attorney then informed Marianne that Lucas would not yet provide a sworn statement because doing so could expose him to prosecution. The confession we had heard in private was not evidence we could safely use without his cooperation. In one afternoon, Mason had taken Ellie, frozen our money, weakened our witness, and turned my own angry words into a weapon. For the first time, I wondered whether patience had simply given him time to surround us. Hannah disappeared from the kitchen while Marianne and I discussed the hearing. I found her in Claire's old sewing room, sitting on the floor beside a cedar chest. She held her phone in one hand and her wedding ring in the other. Mason had sent a photograph of Ellie asleep beneath a purple quilt at Patricia's house. His message read, "Sign the consent. Come home. And this ends." Hannah said, "Maybe I should do it." I sat beside her but did not touch her until she leaned against my shoulder. "If I go back, he'll give me Ellie," she said. "The company accounts will open. Lucas can fix what he did. Nobody else has to suffer." Every sentence was Mason's logic spoken in her voice. I wanted to order her not to return, but commands were the language he had used. So I asked what she believed would happen after the next signature. She looked at the brace on her wrist and whispered, "There would be a number 49. Before we could say more, my phone rang. It was Mason. I put him on speaker at Hannah's request. He said the buyer had advanced the Riverbend closing and that unless I signed within 48 hours, the deal would collapse and the bank would begin enforcement. I told him our meeting would proceed as planned. His voice lost its warmth. "You think paperwork will save you," he said. "But Hannah will choose her daughter. Lucas will choose his freedom. And your employees will choose their paychecks. You'll be standing alone with a building no bank will touch." Then he asked to speak to Hannah. She took the phone, listened as he promised to forgive her, and said only, "I'll see you at the hearing." After the call ended, she slid the wedding ring into Claire's cedar chest. It was a small act, nearly silent, but it was the first decision she had made without asking what it would cost the rest of us. The next morning, Marianne received notice that the custody hearing and the bank's emergency request regarding Riverbend would be addressed on the same day. In separate proceedings, only hours apart. Mason had arranged the timing to exhaust us and force a settlement. Lucas still refused to sign a statement. The bank still treated the altered guarantee as potentially valid. Hannah's credibility would be attacked using years of medical records Mason had helped shape. I looked at the 48 evidence folders lined across Marianne's conference table and understood that truth alone was not enough. Truth had to survive procedure, fear, and the people who benefited from calling it instability. Our trap required Mason to believe he had already won, but by then the cost of letting him believe it included my granddaughter's safety, my daughter's courage, and the company I had built to protect them. I told Marianne to confirm the Riverbend meeting. Then I signed the notice stating I was prepared to approve the sale. The morning after I signed the notice, I drove to Bennett Holdings before sunrise and sat alone in the conference room where Mason believed he would take Riverbend from us. The table was polished walnut, 20 feet long, purchased by Claire when our company survived its first recession. She had called it the place where people should tell the truth before money makes them forget it. I had failed that rule more than once. Marianne arrived carrying 3 binders, one for the forged member consent, one for Hannah's 48 records, and one for the altered guarantee. We agreed that none of them would be displayed at the Riverbend meeting unless Mason first confirmed his version of events. The objective was not to surprise him with accusations. It was to make him voluntarily identify the documents he trusted, explain where they came from, and ask other people to rely on them. Once he did that, he could no longer retreat behind confusion, clerical error, or Lucas's authority. My public surrender began with a carefully worded email. I told Mason, Lucas, the buyer, and the bank that I was prepared to approve the $5 million sale if the proceeds paid all disputed obligations, protected employee benefits, and released Bennett Holdings from further claims. I added that Hannah remained physically unable to attend long meetings, so she might participate remotely. Mason objected within minutes. He insisted Hannah appear in person to confirm her consent. Marianne replied that the operating agreement allowed remote participation, but I overruled her publicly and said Hannah would attend. The performance worked. Mason called me privately and praised my return to common sense. He even apologized for the custody filing, describing it as a temporary precaution made necessary by my behavior. I told him I understood. The words tasted like rust, but my tone stayed weary rather than angry. He needed to hear defeat, not strategy, and I gave him exactly enough to become careless. Hannah spent that week preparing with Renee and Marianne. She practiced describing each incident without apologizing, minimizing, or guessing at Mason's motives. The exercise exhausted her. After 10 minutes, her shoulders would tighten and her breathing would shorten, especially when Marianne played the role of Mason's attorney and challenged inconsistencies in dates. Renee stopped the sessions whenever Hannah began answering too quickly. You are allowed to pause, she reminded her. Silence does not mean you are lying. That lesson seemed simple, but Mason had trained Hannah to fill every silence before he used it against her. She also underwent an independent psychological evaluation requested by our attorney. The clinician confirmed anxiety and trauma symptoms but found no evidence that Hannah was delusional, abusing medication, or unable to parent. We already knew Mason would portray the evaluation as paid family propaganda. Still, it established something important. Hannah's fear had a cause, and the cause was not instability hidden inside her. Denise Parker came to my house on Wednesday evening carrying her notary journal in a canvas grocery bag. She looked offended before she looked frightened. When Marianne showed her the sale consent, Denise immediately pointed to the seal. That is an image from the Millstone lease, she said. 3 years earlier, she had notarized my signature on a warehouse lease, and the scan had been saved in the corporate archive. The tiny scratch along the lower edge of the seal matched a defect in that old scan, not her current stamp. Her journal contained no entry for Hannah, Mason, Riverbend, or the date printed on the draft. Denise remembered Lucas asking her to email a high-resolution copy of the Millstone lease during our office relocation. He said the bank needed it for archive verification. She had complied without concern. Now she covered her mouth with one hand and said, I gave them the seal. I told her the same thing I had finally learned to tell Hannah. Providing access under false pretenses did not make her responsible for how Mason used it. The digital investigators found another detail buried in the metadata. The forged consent had been assembled on a laptop registered to Coal Recovery Services. then exported to PDF under a user profile named LBC admin. Those were Lucas Bennett Cole's initials only if someone combined Lucas's name with Mason's surname. A taunting little label, Mason probably considered clever. More important, the file history showed 3 earlier versions. In the first, Hannah's signature line was empty. In the second, her scanned signature appeared without a notary block. The third added Denise's copied seal and a sentence stating Hannah had signed freely after receiving independent advice. That sentence had no source in our operating agreement. It was added because Mason knew coercion would become an issue. The document itself revealed his awareness. He was not merely fabricating approval. He was manufacturing a defense to the exact accusation he expected Hannah to make. Marianne smiled without pleasure when she saw it. He wrote the rebuttal before anyone accused him. She said, "That is consciousness, not carelessness." Lucas remained our weakest point. His lawyer allowed Marianne to speak with him only in the lawyer's presence. Inside a windowless office overlooking the courthouse, Lucas looked as though he had not slept. I told him I had suspended his management authority under the misconduct provision of our operating agreement. He would retain his ownership interest, but he could no longer approve payments, access servers, direct staff, or represent Bennett Holdings. Lucas stared at me and asked whether I intended to remove him permanently. "That depends on what you do next," I said. His lawyer warned him not to answer. Hannah, who had chosen to attend, placed the hospital photograph of her broken wrist on the table. "You keep asking what Dad will do to you," she said. "You still haven't asked what Mason did to me." Lucas began crying, but Hannah did not move to comfort him. Love had always made her rescue other people from the consequences of hurting her. That day, she let him sit with his own shame. Mason retaliated before Lucas made a decision. He released my old voicemail, advising Hannah not to destroy a good marriage over one terrible argument. He sent it to board members, employees, and a local business reporter, along with a statement claiming I had supported the marriage until a property dispute began. The recording was authentic. Hearing my own voice say those words made me physically ill. My advisors suggested denying context, but I refused. I gathered our department managers and played the entire voicemail, including the part where Hannah sounded frightened, and I changed the subject to Mason's work schedule. Then I told them I had been wrong. I heard discomfort and chose an explanation that required nothing from me. I said, "That failure belongs to me. It does not make the injuries, forged documents, or missing money imaginary." Some employees remained skeptical. 2 supervisors resigned from a committee overseeing Riverbend. Yet Mason's weapon lost some power because I stopped defending the man I had once been. The financial pressure continued. One customer delayed a major order, and an insurer demanded additional collateral before renewing our performance bond. I sold a collection of antique construction tools my father had left me, including the brass transit he carried when surveying our first warehouse site. The sale covered employee benefits for another month. Hannah watched the auction company load the cases into a van and asked whether Riverbend was worth sacrificing everything attached to it. I told her the buildings were not the point. "Then what is?" she asked. I looked at the empty shelf where my father's transit had sat for 30 years. "The point is that Mason decided Payne was a valid signature," I said. "If we let that signature stand, every document after it becomes another injury." Hannah nodded, but she also reminded me that she did not want her life turned into a campaign to save my company. I promised the case would serve her safety first, even if protecting her meant Riverbend eventually had to be sold legitimately. 2 days before the meeting, Simon informed Marianne that Mason had arranged a $500,000 earnest money deposit from the proposed buyer. The buyer, Alder Crest Development, wanted the funds released as soon as the member consent was confirmed. Public records showed Alder Crest had been formed only 8 months earlier, but its listed managers appeared independent. I recognized one surname, Darnell. Mason's cousin, Everett Darnell, had once worked at Coal Recovery Services. Further investigation showed Everett owned a minority interest in another company that had supplied Alder Crest's initial capital. The connection did not automatically invalidate the sale, but our operating agreement required disclosure of any related interest. Mason had disclosed none. His motive became clearer. Selling Riverbend below market would not only repay his loans, it would place valuable property in a company connected to his family. giving him a hidden path to future profit after the Bennetts absorbed the loss. Marianne sought an emergency order preventing the transfer of title until the signature dispute could be reviewed. We did not ask the court to cancel the meeting. Canceling it would warn Mason. The judge issued a narrow temporary restraint. No deed could be recorded, and no earnest money released without further order. But the parties could continue negotiations. The ruling was sealed until notice could be formally served. We arranged for service to occur only after Mason began the meeting. It was a legal timing decision, not theater. Once he asked the bank and buyer to rely on the documents, the order would preserve the property while his statements were recorded. Denise agreed to attend and say only that she wanted to confirm her notarial record. Simon would attend as the bank's risk representative. The buyer sent its attorney and chief investment officer. Mason believed he was walking into a closing. In reality, every institution he had manipulated would be seated at the same table. Then Lucas nearly ruined everything. The night before the meeting, he entered the downtown office using an old emergency key card that should have been disabled. Security alerted me at 1:14 p.m. I watched remotely as he moved toward the archive room. For one terrible minute, I believed my son had chosen Mason again and was trying to destroy the original records. I called building security but told them not to approach until police arrived. Lucas emerged carrying a red accordion folder and sat on the hallway floor. When officers reached him, he surrendered it immediately. The folder contained bank statements, vendor invoices, and handwritten notes documenting his theft and Mason's blackmail. Lucas said Mason had ordered him to retrieve and burn it because the documents connected Northline Capital to both of them. Instead, Lucas had decided to turn it over. His decision came late, after years of cowardice, but it was his first action that cost him something rather than costing Hannah. Lucas's lawyer negotiated a controlled disclosure to Marianne and the appropriate investigators. He would not receive immunity merely for cooperating, and I refused to make his protection a condition of our case. Still, his records strengthened the existing chain. They showed Mason had demanded access to corporate archives months before the forged Riverbend consent appeared. One note, written in Lucas's hand, recorded Mason saying, "Hannah signs when she is scared enough." Lucas claimed he wrote it after Mason threatened to handle her refusal. Marianne asked why he had kept the note. Lucas answered, "I wanted proof in case he turned on me." Hannah stared at him for a long moment. "You saved evidence to protect yourself," she said, "but not me." Lucas lowered his head. There was no response that could improve the truth. She left the room before he could apologize. Outside, she told me she would testify, but she would not sit beside her brother at the meeting. Mason noticed Lucas had stopped responding and adjusted his plan. At 7 the next morning, he emailed everyone a new affidavit, supposedly signed by Hannah 3 months earlier. It stated that any future accusations of coercion should be attributed to anxiety and family pressure. Hannah recognized the signature from a school enrollment form Mason had asked her to complete. The affidavit was not notarized, but its existence showed he anticipated her resistance long before the hospital. He also announced that Lucas would participate by video due to illness, clearly expecting to control whatever explanation Lucas gave. I replied that all members must attend personally because the buyer had requested final verification. Mason called and accused me of changing conditions. I let my voice shake when I answered, "I cannot survive another delay." I told him, "Get Lucas there. Get Hannah there. And let us finish this." He believed my fear because much of it was real. The meeting began at 10 o'clock on Friday. Mason arrived first with 2 attorneys and a leather portfolio thick enough to suggest certainty. He greeted the buyer's representatives, shook Simon's hand, and ignored Denise except to thank her for helping finalize the original consent. Denise's expression did not change. Lucas entered through a side door with his attorney and sat at the far end of the table. Mason's smile faltered for the first time. Hannah came in beside Renee, wearing a navy dress that covered none of the healing bruise beneath her jaw. She did not look at Mason. I took the chair opposite him and announced that the session would be recorded as an official member meeting. Mason objected, then agreed, when the buyer's lawyer said the recording protected everyone. Marianne placed the draft sale resolution in front of him and asked whether it was the document on which he expected the bank, buyer, and Bennett members to rely. Mason looked around the table, saw no police, No accusation, and no visible evidence binders. Confidence returned to his face. Yes, he said. That consent reflects the agreement reached by all necessary parties. Marianne asked whether Hannah had signed willingly. He answered, absolutely. She asked whether Denise witnessed the signature. Mason placed one hand on the document and said, the notarial acknowledgement speaks for itself. Denise quietly opened her journal. Before she could respond, a process server entered and handed Mason the temporary restraining order, preventing transfer of Riverbend or release of the earnest money. Mason read the first page, then looked at me with hatred stripped of every polite layer. You set this up, he said. I did not deny it. Marianne turned on the display screen behind us, where the first of the 3 metadata versions appeared. No, she said. You set it up. We only invited everyone who relied on it. Mason did not collapse. Men like him do not abandon control because one door closes. He immediately claimed Lucas had prepared the consent without his knowledge, and that Hannah had personally delivered the signed version to his office. Lucas's attorney interrupted and stated that his client disputed that account. Mason then turned to Hannah. Tell them what your father promised you, he said. Tell them he threatened to take Ellie unless you helped him destroy me. Hannah's face went pale, and for a moment I feared the room, the attorneys, and the recording light would pull her back into silence. She looked at me. I wanted to answer for her, but I had done that in different ways all her life. So I waited. Hannah placed her good hand on the table and said, my father promised me nothing. You promised to hurt everyone I loved until I signed. Mason leaned forward and whispered, think carefully about what happens next. The threat was quiet, but every microphone captured it. The buyer's attorney requested an immediate adjournment. Simon announced that the bank would preserve all loan records and refer suspected document manipulation to its fraud unit. Denise stated for the recording that she had never witnessed Hannah's signature and that the seal on the consent came from an older scanned document. Mason's lawyers asked him to stop speaking, but his control was already slipping. He accused Denise of lying, Lucas of stealing, Hannah of instability, and me of sacrificing employees for revenge. Each accusation contradicted the cooperative family agreement he had claimed minutes earlier. Yet the meeting did not end in victory. The buyer refused to close. The bank maintained the freeze, and Mason's attorneys announced they would challenge the restraining order that afternoon. Worse, the custody hearing remained scheduled for the following morning, where a different judge would decide whether Hannah could bring Ellie home. As we left the conference room, Mason passed close enough for only Hannah and me to hear him. Riverbend was never the only leverage, he said. Then he smiled at Hannah. Ask your father what happens when the court sees the original videos. Hannah stopped walking. She had never mentioned videos, and neither had the 48 files. Mason continued toward the elevators before we could question him. Marianne warned us not to assume he possessed what he claimed. But Hannah's breathing became shallow. She remembered Mason placing cameras inside their home for security and controlling the account through his phone. The recordings might show arguments, panic attacks, or moments he had provoked and edited. At the courthouse entrance, we received his latest filing. 12 video clips offered as proof that Hannah was dangerous around Ellie. The hearing would begin at 9 the next morning. Our property trap had worked, but Mason had moved the final battle to the one thing Hannah valued more than any building: account, or family name, her right to be her daughter's mother. At 9 the next morning, Mason entered family court carrying 12 video clips and the confidence of a man who believed images would erase everything that happened before the camera started recording. Hannah sat beside Marianne with both hands folded in her lap, the brace removed, but her wrist still swollen. I sat behind them under an order forbidding me from speaking unless called. Mason's attorney opened by describing Hannah as volatile, medicated, and easily influenced by me. The first clip showed her screaming in the kitchen while Ellie cried in another room. The second showed Hannah throwing a glass into the sink. The third showed her striking Mason's chest with both palms. None lasted longer than 40 seconds. Taken alone, they were ugly. Hannah watched without turning away, though I saw her fingers press white against each other. Mason watched the judge instead, measuring every reaction. He had chosen the worst seconds of her life and arranged them like a resume. When the final clip ended, Mason's attorney said the videos proved Hannah created the danger inside the home. Marianne did not object to their admission. Instead, she asked for the file information from each exhibit to remain visible on the courtroom screen. The clips had dates and timestamps, and Hannah's 48 entry log contained those same dates. Clip 3 came from Incident 29. Clip 7 came from Incident 34. Clip 12 was recorded the night before, Incident 47. Marianne asked Mason whether the cameras recorded continuously. He said they activated only when motion was detected. She asked whether he controlled the account. He answered yes. Then she asked why every clip began after an argument had already started and ended before anyone calmed down. Mason said the system divided recordings automatically. Marianne displayed the export data gathered from his own filing. Each file had been manually trimmed on the same laptop used to assemble the forged Riverbend consent. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear the ventilation fan above the judge. Marianne played the longest clip again. But this time she stopped it after Hannah shouted, "Don't touch me again," in Mason's submitted version. The recording began 1 second later. The incident log for that date stated that he had taken Hannah's car keys, blocked the back door, and told her she would never see Ellie alone if she refused to approve another transfer. The corresponding bank record showed $48,000 leaving Hannah's account the next morning. Mason's attorney argued that the diary was self-serving. Marianne agreed that a diary alone could be challenged. Then she paired the date with the transfer. A pharmacy receipt, a photograph of bruising, Mason's apology message, and the video he had selected. In the full sequence, the clip did not prove Hannah became violent without cause. It proved Mason understood exactly when to start preserving her reaction and when to remove his provocation. He had not documented instability. He had curated it. Hannah testified after a short recess. Her voice shook at first, but she did not rush to fill the silence. She explained that Mason installed the cameras after claiming burglars had targeted nearby homes. He alone controlled the password. When arguments began, he would sometimes glance toward a camera before changing his tone. He spoke softly while she panicked, then replayed her reaction and told her nobody would believe what came before it. Mason's attorney asked why Hannah pushed him in one clip. She answered, "Because he was standing between me and the room where my daughter was crying." He asked why she threw the glass. "Because he told me my father had pledged our family property and that everyone would lose their jobs if I left." He asked whether she suffered anxiety. "Yes," she said. "Living with someone who hurt me and then saved the most frightened moments made me anxious." She did not claim perfection. That honesty weakened every attempt to make one bad reaction equal 4 years of abuse. Mason took the stand believing he could restore control. He said Hannah had rewritten ordinary marital disputes after I turned Riverbend into a family war. Marianne asked whether he had ever required her to sign financial documents after arguments. He denied it. She showed him Incident 18, the questionable subcontractor invoice, and his email sent 3 hours later saying, "Thank you for finally being reasonable." He called that coincidence. She showed him Incident 41 and the altered guarantee. He said Lucas provided it. She showed him the 3 versions of the forged consent, all created on his company laptop. He blamed an employee. Then Marianne placed the meeting transcript before him and read his statement that Hannah had signed willingly before Denise. Denise had already denied witnessing it. "Were you mistaken then?" Marianne asked. "Or are you mistaken now?" Mason looked toward his attorneys. "For the first time since I met him." No answer arrived quickly enough to sound prepared. The judge did not decide the criminal questions. She made that distinction clear, but she found Mason's evidence selective, his explanations inconsistent, and his use of Ellie as leverage deeply concerning. Hannah received temporary primary custody, and Mason's contact was restricted to professionally supervised visits pending a full evaluation. A protection order barred him from approaching Hannah's home, workplace, or medical providers. When the ruling was read, Hannah did not smile. She closed her eyes and released a breath she seemed to have held for 4 years. Patricia brought Ellie to the courthouse that afternoon. The child ran toward her mother, then stopped halfway as though waiting for permission. Hannah knelt despite the pain in her wrist and opened both arms. Ellie crossed the hallway and buried her face against Hannah's shoulder. I turned away, partly to give them privacy and partly because I could not bear the knowledge that my granddaughter had learned to hesitate before seeking comfort. The Riverbend hearing began 2 days later in a civil courtroom upstairs. Mason arrived without the polished calm he had worn at the family hearing. His lender had suspended Cole Recovery Services' credit line. Alder Crest had demanded its deposit back, and his attorneys now disagreed openly about strategy. Simon testified first. He explained that the bank relied on the altered guarantee, Lucas' confirmation, Hannah's supposed consent, and my prior public endorsements. The original guarantee in Marianne's binder contained the missing limitation page and expiration clause. Simon then identified the substituted version submitted by Mason. The paper, typeface, and signature were genuine because most of the document was genuine. Only the page defining liability had been replaced. That is why it passed an initial review. Simon said, the fraud did not imitate the Bennett family's credibility. It used it. I listened, without defending myself. The statement was painful because it was accurate. Denise followed with her notary journal. She showed the numbered entries before and after the date on the forged consent. Neither involved Hannah or Riverbend. She identified the scratch in the copied seal and traced it to the millstone lease stored in our archive. The digital investigator explained the server access, the export history, and the security footage of Mason entering the office with Lucas at 1:03 in the morning. None of this evidence was new. We had spent weeks preserving it because Marianne knew a satisfying accusation and a provable case were different things. Mason's attorney argued that Lucas possessed authority and could have prepared documents independently. That argument made Lucas essential. He entered the courtroom with his own lawyer, looking older than he had a month earlier. Hannah sat across the aisle and did not meet his eyes. I could not tell whether my son would tell the truth until he raised his hand and swore to do it. Lucas admitted taking $320,000 from the reserve account, falsifying entries, and hiding the loss. He admitted Mason discovered the scheme and blackmailed him. He admitted opening the archive, downloading Hannah's signature, and sending the records to Mason. His attorney objected repeatedly when questions approached possible criminal charges, but Lucas kept answering within the agreement governing his cooperation. Then Marianne asked whether Mason ever discussed how he would obtain Hannah's consent. Lucas looked at his sister and said, "He told me she signed when she was scared enough." Mason shouted that Lucas was lying to save himself. The judge ordered him silent. Lucas produced the red accordion folder, including his handwritten note and the Northline records. He did not present himself as a rescuer. I knew she was afraid. He said, I told myself I didn't know why because knowing would require me to stop him. I protected my secret instead of my sister. That confession destroyed the final support beneath Mason's version. The judge extended the order preventing any Riverbend transfer, ruled that the disputed consent could not authorize a sale, and appointed a temporary neutral manager over major Bennett Holdings transactions while the civil claims proceeded. The bank withdrew recognition of the altered guarantee and referred the matter to federal and state investigators. Alder Crest terminated its purchase agreement after its connection to Everett Darnell became public in the proceedings, because the earnest money had remained in escrow. Mason never received it. Cole Recovery Services lost the credit line it needed to operate at its previous scale. None of these consequences came from a dramatic speech or a secret document pulled from my pocket. They came from Mason choosing, again and again, to make respectable institutions rely on papers he knew had been created through fear. Outside the courtroom, Mason waited until his attorneys moved ahead, then turned toward me. A deputy stood close enough to intervene, but Mason only said, "You destroyed your daughter's husband, your son's future, and your own company. Was being right worth it? Months earlier, I might have answered with anger. I might have listed the accounts, properties, and people still loyal to me. Instead, I said, you are still counting what other people lost because of what you did." He laughed once, though there was no humor in it. "Hannah will need me when the money runs out." Hannah had approached behind me and heard him. She stepped to my side. "Not behind it. No," she said. "I needed the man you pretended to be. He never existed." Mason's face changed then. Losing Riverbend hurt him. Losing credit frightened him. But losing the belief that Hannah would always return struck the thing he valued most: control. The investigations did not produce instant justice. Real consequences rarely arrive in one clean sentence. Mason was charged months later with offenses connected to document fraud, coercive financial conduct, and the loan submissions. His attorneys negotiated, contested, and delayed. Coal recovery services entered restructuring, and several innocent employees lost jobs, despite our efforts to place them elsewhere. Hannah grieved that damage even while knowing she had not caused it. Patricia blamed us and remained convinced her son had been cornered by powerful Bennetts. Mason's supervised visits with Ellie continued under strict rules, and every exchange reopened some wound. Lucas entered a repayment agreement, resigned from all management positions, and faced his own legal consequences for the money he had taken. I paid for neither silence nor escape. He remained my son, but being my son no longer meant I would erase the cost of his choices. Riverbend stayed in the family company, though not under the old arrangement. I hired an independent management firm and changed the operating rules so no family member could unilaterally access archived signatures, notary records, or guarantees. Major transactions required outside review. Hannah's ownership interest was transferred into a protected trust for her and Ellie, managed by a professional fiduciary rather than by me. At first, giving up control felt like another loss. Then I understood that control had been the language all three Bennett men used when we claimed to be protecting her. Mason controlled through fear. Lucas controlled information to preserve himself. I controlled money and called it care. The trust ensured that no husband, brother, or father could turn Hannah's security into leverage again. When I signed the documents, Marianne asked whether I was certain. For once, I said, "The point is that my certainty should not be required." Hannah moved with Ellie into a modest white house near a neighborhood school. The home was smaller than the one she had shared with Mason, but every key belonged to her. She returned to accounting part-time for a nonprofit that helped women rebuild credit after leaving controlling relationships. Some mornings she called me because a sound outside had frightened her. Other weeks she needed distance and did not call at all. I learned not to interpret either choice as rejection. I stopped arriving with solutions before asking what she needed. Sometimes the answer was help with Ellie. Sometimes it was a contractor's number. Sometimes it was nothing more than, "Believe me, and don't take over." Lucas wrote her letters she did not answer. I did not pressure her to forgive him. Forgiveness demanded for family harmony is only another form of payment extracted from the person already hurt. Almost a year after the hospital night, Simon Keene visited Riverbend to close the bank's review. He stood with me outside Warehouse 3 while trucks moved through the loading yard. I thanked him for approaching me in the garage. He shook his head. "I gave you a warning," he said. "Your daughter gave you the case." Before leaving, he looked toward the buildings and added, "Most people think backing means someone powerful is protecting the wrong man. Sometimes it means ordinary people keep lending him pieces of their credibility." After he drove away, I walked through the warehouse where my father's brass transit had once marked the first foundation line. I still missed the tool I sold to cover benefits. I missed the company we had before suspicion entered every office. Winning had not restored what existed. It had only stopped the losses from becoming permission for the next one. That evening, I went to Hannah's house to help Ellie install a new porch light. Ellie held the screws in a paper cup while I balanced on a short ladder. When the bulb came on, warm light spread across the steps and the fresh blue paint on the door. Inside, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with 2 notebooks. The first was the one containing 48 incidents. Its cover was bent, and several pages carried hospital stickers and evidence labels. She placed it inside a storage box that Marianne would keep until the remaining cases ended. Then she opened a clean notebook. I expected her to write number 49. Instead, she wrote the date and beneath it, "First night we stopped asking permission to feel safe." She closed the book, joined Ellie on the porch, and handed me a cup of coffee. No one gave a speech. We simply stood beneath the light. For most of my life, I believed a father protected his family by being the strongest man in the room, paying the bill, signing the contract, and knowing what should happen next. Mason used that belief against all of us because he understood its weakness better than I did. Strength without listening becomes authority, and authority can silence the very person it claims to defend. I could not erase the 48 times Hannah was hurt. I could not return the years Lucas traded for secrecy or the jobs Mason's company took down with him. What I could do was stop asking my daughter to prove pain in a language comfortable for me. She had brought photographs, transfers, message, dates, and signatures because one truth had never seemed sufficient. I wish I had believed her before she needed 48 pieces of evidence. In the end, fighting back did not begin when I trapped Mason in a lie. It began when I finally stopped speaking over Hannah and let her truth stand on its own.